Hello, everyone. This is Debra Richardson, and today I am putting the AP in Happy, where accounts payable teams are empowered to protect the vendor master file from fraud. This podcast will give a voice to accounts payable team members by talking about the growing reality of cyber attacks in their world and which vendor setup and vendor management techniques they can apply to protect the vendor master file from fraud. Need training? Visit the Vendor Process Training Center to enroll in your choice of weekly live and on-demand training sessions. Plus, get access to vendor setup form templates and reference tools that will help you and your team to reduce the potential for fraud, compliance fines, and just overall bad vendor data. So sign up for a free account to get access to free training sessions, vendor process FAQs, and a resource library with information you need to manage your vendor master file. Visit training.debrarrichardson.com today. The link will be in the show notes. Around April of every year, right after the tax filing season for 1099s and 1042s, just when you think you're done with IRS tasks for now, you receive an IRS CP2100 notification. Now what? Keep listening. Welcome to episode 382. 3 facts about the IRS CP2100 notification you may be receiving in April. So, first of all, I want to talk about what CP2100 notices are. So, let's talk about first what CP2100 notifications or notices are. And I am taking this from the IRS page called Understanding Your CP2100 or CP2100A Notice. And we'll talk about the difference between the two in just a moment. But I will put a link to this in the show notes. So what the IRS says is these are when you filed your tax filing and for your reportable vendors, the information included in that tax filing, meaning the payee's name or the vendor's name and tax ID combination, is either missing or does not match their records. And so when the IRS does their check and something's wrong with the legal name tax ID combination, then they will send a CP2100 or CP2100A notice. And the difference between the two is just the number. So if you had 50 or more that were incorrect, you're going to get the CP2100 notice. If you had less than 50 information returns that were incorrect or that had errors, then you're going to get the CP2100A. Now, of course, you definitely want to get the CP2100A. Now, a precaution here that I saw when I was a practitioner, and most of you know, if you've listened to my podcast for a number of episodes, that I used to be a practitioner. I was AP Senior Manager over Global Vendor Setup and Maintenance. We maintained 140,000 active vendors, which converted to about 30,000 1099s and 1042s that we had to file. And so, that's a lot. But I will tell you, we did get the CP2100A, just so you know. But, for that volume, it wasn't that bad. But the thing about it is that we never got the notices like directly for some reason. And that was because while we were submitting 1099s, right, the payroll department was submitting their W-2s. And so the IRS, and it was for the same company. So the IRS would just send the CP2100 notice to the last address that was used for the last filing. And so if payroll filed last, then that means that's the address that it would go to. And normally this probably wouldn't be a problem if it was in the same building. Well, it could be, right? Because you still got to know that it went over to that department. They may not just give it to you. But when I was the practitioner in that particular role, payroll was in a whole different state. And so we always had to coordinate with payroll to get our CP2100 notices. So you may have to do the same thing if you do not receive any in April. But we'll talk about when you may get them and whether or not you expect to get them or not in April, because there is a caveat with that. All right, so that's the CP2100 notice, and that's the difference between the CP2100 and the CP2100A. It's just volume. And again, I will put a link to that IRS page in the show notes. All right, and before we talk about I talk about the three facts, I do want to let you know I have a link in the show notes to a training session called Handling CP2100, CP2100A Notifications, and B Notices. And this training will be live on Thursday, April 9th, 2026. And it will be from 12 p.m. to 1 p.m. Eastern Time. But if you're listening to this after that, or you're not able to quickly get the training session, the cost of it approved, after that, within 24 hours, so by the next day, Friday, April 10th, 2026, and after, it will be available to watch the recording. So I'm going to put a link to that in the show notes, and there I will go in much more detail about handling those notifications and the subsequent B notice and the backup withholding. All right, so let's get into the three facts. So the first one is that the vendors that are listed on the April version of the CP2100 notifications, these are the tax filings, the vendors that you paid in tax year 2024. But these are the corrections. So the way that it goes is the CP2100A, CP2100 notifications or notices go out in twice a year, once in September and once in April. In September, you get the tax year that you most recently filed, all of the tax filings that were done on time. And then the following April, you get all the corrections for that same tax year. So in September 2025, you received CP2100 CP2100 notices for tax year 2024 that were filed on time, either in January or in March, depending on the type of 1099 form or type of tax form that you submitted. Now, the ones coming in April, if you had any corrections to all of those, right, because your vendors may not have filed until like April 15th of that year. And so they didn't even notice that things were wrong until after you did your final filing, your filing on time. And so now you got to go and do corrections. And so those corrections, if there were any errors in the legal name, tax ID combinations, or if you had a missing tax ID, that's what's showing up in April. All right, so that was the first fact. Now, fact number 2 and fact number 3 are both related to what you have to do next. So fact number 2 is for missing or obviously incorrect tax IDs, like if you had all 9s or all 0s, then your next step is you have to back up withhold. And according to the IRS page, if you have a missing or obviously incorrect 10, you are actually supposed to back up withhold before you even made that first payment. And so if you are not already collecting the W-9 or the tax ID and doing the IRS 10 match, if you get a vendors on this list that on the CP2100, CP2100A notification or notice that has a missing or obviously incorrect 10, that's a trigger that you need to go back and, if you haven't already, require a tax ID and validate that it is correct by doing the IRS 10 match before you make your first payment. But since that wasn't done and you ended up having to file with the IRS with either a missing 10 or obviously incorrect 10, then you need to begin backup withholding immediately. And let me just say, I talked about I was a practitioner and we had 140,000 active vendors. That was actually across 7 different ERPs. And do you know that only one actually, we had SAP and we had 2 versions of SAP, and I can't remember if the second version had backup withholding or not, but I know that we only used one backup withholding flow, that functionality in SAP. The other 5, maybe 6 instances or accounting system or ERPs, that whole backup withholding process was manual. So that was a mess. Hopefully yours is not that way. If you had any vendors that are on the list that had missing or, obviously incorrect tax IDs where you have to back up withhold. And something that I didn't realize is that the IRS says that you have to make up to 3 requests for the 10 to avoid a penalty for not including a 10 on the information return. So, it pays to actually read the instructions from the IRS, and don't feel bad if you haven't yet, because all the time that I was a practitioner, there were still some things that I learned afterwards, because you just don't have time to go through all of that. One of them has to do with the word "the," which could be a reason why some of your vendors are on this list. Did you know that if you have a vendor whose first name begins with "the" and the is followed by only one other word, then the is included in the name control? That could be a reason why your vendor's on this list. And I will tell you that when I had my naming conventions for the team, we just automatically dropped the word "the." But we didn't look at, and I didn't know, so I didn't include it in there, right? That if a vendor's name followed by or had a "the" in it was only followed by one other word, that I should have included it in there. So, don't feel bad if you didn't know about that, because there are some things that I didn't know about until afterwards either. But you know what? When you know better, you do better. So, with that being said, that's the second thing, is that you may have to back up withhold if you had any missing or obviously incorrect tax IDs. All right. Now, the third fact is you have to send B notices. And so B notices are sent for incorrect 10s that don't match. So these are not the obviously incorrect 10s. This may be 10s that somebody fat fingered and, nobody did an IRS 10 match before the reporting was done, or the vendor may have been merged or acquired, that changed their tax ID, or maybe they changed their legal name and they just didn't tell you, because it just didn't affect their payments, and for whatever reason they didn't know that you needed to know. So you have to send a B notice for them. But you know what? You also have to send a B notice for those folks that you're backup withholding for, that you immediately had to backup withholding for because the 10 was missing or obviously incorrect. Because at some point you want to stop backup withholding. And so you're going to send a B notice for both of those, or really all the vendors included, and you're going to either send the first B notice or a second B notice. And B notice is really just verbiage that you need to include in your communication to the vendor to request a valid tax ID. And so there are two. The first B notice, you want to ask for a properly completed and signed W-9. And by the way, when they say signed W-9, as of today, the uh, uh, requirement for a handwritten signature is definitely needed when you are collecting a W-9 for because of a CP2100, CP2100A notice. So it does have to be a wet signature. And if you haven't heard of that before, you might want to take the W-9 training session on the Vendor Process Training Center. I will put a link to that because I talk all about the handwritten signature requirements, when a W-9 is required, when it's not. And then I also go through all of the W-9 examples by tax classification. So I'll put a link to that in the show notes. So the first B notice, right? You want to make sure that you get a properly completed and signed Form W-9 or acceptable substitute if you have an IRS substitute W-9. And then if you get a second notification within 3 years, like if that vendor's name and tax ID is on a CP2100A or CP2100 notice twice within 3 years, then you have to give them the verbiage for the second B notice. And that comes with some different requirements because for this one, the vendor also has to give you either their social security card if they're individual sole proprietor, right, where the IRS requires a social security number or they provide a social security number, or a letter 147C from the IRS verifying the name and number are correct. And so how do you know if your vendor was on a different CP2100, 2100A notice within the last 3 years? Well, you just have to go back and look for that unless you are documenting. And I talk about that too in the handling CP2100, CP2100A notices in the training session that is going to be linked in the show notes. All right, so those are the 3 facts about the IRS CP2100 notifications. So thanks, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the 382nd episode of the Putting the AP in Happy podcast, where accounts payable teams are empowered to protect the vendor master file from fraud. Don't forget to check the show notes for the links mentioned in the podcast. And if you enjoyed this episode, consider subscribing and writing a review of my podcast on the platform that you use to listen. Stay happy.